Chapter 2.
Have you ever used a cutting blaster before, Lando? Lobot asked with concern.
Lots of times.
Said Lando, bracing himself between the inner bulkhead and the equipment sled.
But don't ask me for a list. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on all of them. R2, can I have a little more light in here, right in front of me?
The dome-topped droid drifted up and forward on tiny puffs of thruster gas, changing the angle of the light slightly.
That's good, R2. Hold right there.
Be careful not to cut too deeply, Lobot said. There may be mechanisms behind the wall.
If R2's right, there's nothing behind this part of the wall. The sonogram showed a thin bulkhead and another compartment beyond, 5 meters in diameter.
I know, but a ship this size could have waste ports 5 meters in diameter, or fuel conduits.
You know, Lobot, when you're cut off from your databases, you're almost as much of an old lady as 3PO here.
Lando said, but not without affection.
3PO, any change?
No, Master Lando. There has been no response to my first 961,008.
Save it for the log,
Lando said.
Lobot, 3PO, I know how much you want to watch over my shoulder while I do this, but if I were you, I'd move around to where my contact suit is between you and the blaster. That way, if I make a mistake, you might still be around to learn from it.
If R2 would give me a link to his video processor, Lobot said.
Do it, R2.
Lando held the cutting blaster up before his face with his right hand, and with his left set the selector for hairline and depth for shallow.
Maybe we'll finally get a response to this message,
he said, and activated the cutting. Under Lando's steady hand, the blue-white energy blade drew a straight line down the face of the bulkhead. But when Lando pulled the blaster away to inspect his work, he found that the blaster had left no mark. The bulkhead was intact.
Guess I was a little too careful,
Lando said, frowning.
Move the sled in just a little for me, Lobot.
When he had finished adjusting his position, Lando reached forward and drew the blaster blade slowly down the face of the bulkhead once more.
What the...
What is happening?
3PO asked worriedly. He rose from behind Lando to peer over his shoulder at the wall.
A lot of nothing,
said Lando in disgust.
I can't even scorch it.
I think you are mistaken, Lando, said Lobot. Please try again, and this time move the cutter more quickly. Lando slashed the cutter downward across the face of the bulkhead. The brilliant glare of the blade left a thin black line in its wake, a clean, straight cut that closed up and vanished a fraction of a second later.
Self-sealing bulkheads?
It would appear so, said Lobot.
Well, that's just dandy,
Lando said, shutting off the cutting blaster.
I can't cut us a door because it hasn't the manners to stay cut.
Lobot tapped Lando on the helmet, then gestured at the blaster. May I try something?
Be my guest.
Lando surrendered the blaster and moved aside, pulling himself hand over hand toward the aft end of the equipment sled. Lobot studied the selectors on the blaster for a few moments, then opted for the medium drill setting. The blade appeared this time as a pointed cone, which Lobot pressed against the wall until half its length had disappeared. When he withdrew it, there was a hole a few centimeters across in the bulkhead. The hole began to close at once, but it took noticeably longer to vanish than the cut had. Long enough for Lobot to pull himself down to eye level and catch a quick glimpse through the breach.
Very clever, Lobot. Very interesting, between 1 and 2 seconds, I think,
Lando said. I was hoping for this result, said Lobot, turning toward Lando. Whatever mechanisms are involved, substantially more material must be transported or replaced to fill a hole than to seal a cut.
Did you see anything?
Nothing useful. An open space of some kind, dimly lit. Everything had a yellowish cast.
Let's try a bigger hole,
Lando said.
R2, do you have some sort of remote sensor you can stick through this time?
The limpet, Lobot suggested. We could reach through and attach the limpet on the other side of the bulkhead. Both R2 and I are capable of receiving its sensor data.
I don't want to make quite that big a hole.
Lando said.
Not this time. Every time we cut into that bulkhead, we're reminding this ship we're here. I don't know how many times we can bite before we get swatted. R2, what about it?
R2 tootled pridefully as a small equipment panel on his body popped open and a slender wand, topped by a small silver ball, unfolded from within.
You needn't be snippy about it.
3PO chided. The response from R2 sounded like an electronic raspberry.
Well, I'm sure it's not his business to keep track of those details.
3PO said, bristling.
I've been in your company for longer than I care to remember, and I certainly don't keep track of every gadget in that ugly little chassis.
Lando whistled sharply.
Whoa, you too. Save it for later. 3PO, was there any part of that I need to know?
Master Lando, R2 says that astromech droids must frequently inspect systems which are located in confined spaces.
3PO said curtly.
He apparently believes that R2 units are important enough that this should be common knowledge. He has quite the little ego, you know.
Yes, well, I've often thought it's a shame he doesn't have your modesty, 3PO.
Lando said, flying himself back to the middle of the equipment sled and reclaiming the cutting blaster from Lobot.
Have you made any new pen pals since we started cutting?
There has been no response whatever from the masters of this vessel since I began trying to hail them,
said 3PO.
I suggest you proceed with whatever you are planning.
Lando changed the selector to medium drill and activated the blaster.
R2, come in close. I want that sensor one through the hole as quickly as possible. But don't let yourself get caught when it closes. And Lobot R2, between the two of you, I want to know exactly how large a hole I make and exactly how long it takes it to close. Is everyone ready? Let's do it then.
The medium setting allowed Lando to open a hole that was nearly large enough to admit a man's clenched fist. Switching off the blaster, Lando pushed off from the wall and did a backward somersault, floating out of R2's way. The droid moved smoothly and surely into position, extending the wand through the very center of the opening and snatching it back at the last moment as the hole disappeared again.
Show us, R2. Holoprojector,
Lando ordered. The droid chirped an acknowledgement and offered up a fisheye perspective of a round-walled passage that seemed to bend around or through the ship in both directions. There was no sign of life or machinery, nor any response to the cutting of the hole and the invasion of R2's scan probe.
Looks promising,
said Lando.
Whatever it is, it could give us access to at least part of the ship. R2, Lobot, what's the verdict? How big a hole do I need to cut to get us all through?
I am afraid there is a problem, Lando, Lobot said. R2's measurements show that the larger hole closed faster per unit of area than the smaller one.
It looked that way to me, too,
Lando agreed.
Bigger holes probably get higher priority from the ship's systems. What don't you think we can get through?
The short dimension of the common wall between that passage and this chamber is approximately 1.7 meters, Lobot said, pointing. My estimate is that a hole that size will take only 6 or 7 seconds to close down to the point where it will be impassable for any of us. That is not enough time to move the sled and the 4 of us into the other chamber.
It might be enough time. Jump troops go out the drop chute of an assault boat at a rate of 1 per second.
Jump troops have the benefit of training and gravity. I have modeled it with R2's nav processor. At best, one of us would not make it through.
Well, that is a problem,
said Lando.
because I have a sneaking suspicion that when we cut a hole that size, this ship's gonna get fed up with us and try to spit us out again. I don't think we'll get a chance to do it twice.
He thought hard for a moment, then waved the blaster in the air.
Everything off the sled. I need to make some modifications.
The equipment sled was an uncomplicated device. Its thick, rectangular frame contained the gyros, fuel cells, and thrust stabilizer system, and also provided cut-out handholds at regular intervals. The standard diamond-patterned metal grid that filled the frame provided a wealth of lockdowns for gear kits and tools. Both sides of the grid on the team's sled were heavily loaded. "Modifications?"
Yeah,
said Lando.
I think we need a frame for our door.
Clinging to the sled with one hand and wielding the cutting blaster with the other, Lando slashed away where the grid joined the sled frame. When he was finished, the sled was in two pieces. Lando pushed the wobbly, heavily loaded grid toward R2.
You tow that through to the other side.
The droid's grappling clamps appeared and latched onto the grid securely.
Give me a hand here, Lobot.
Lobot eased forward and grabbed a handhold at the opposite end of the gutted sled frame. "I am remembering something I accessed earlier," he said. "The chief designer of the Ma'aud funerary temples directed his draftsman that all obvious passages should be booby-trapped, and all traps should be made as inviting as possible."
Thank you for that uplifting thought,
said Lando.
If we get out of this, you should think about a new career as a morale officer. Everyone ready?
Master Lando, what should I do?
Lando checked his combat blaster in its holster, then slid the selector on the cutting blaster to wide.
Add this to our apology,
he said, and pointed it at the bulkhead.
Hang on!
The brilliant flare of the cutting beam momentarily dazzled the view screen of Lando's contact suit, and the vaporized material from 2.5 square meters of bulkhead filled the air as a gray cloud. Before Lando could even see clearly, the hole began to close.
Let's go! Let's go! Get it lined up!
Lando shouted. The two men maneuvered the frame into position, and the bulkhead closed around it as though it were a tailored fit. But as they did, they heard a deep, rumbling groan from the ship, a sound that had no direction. Though the surroundings were alien, the sound was familiar. The signature of a form of stress that aged large vessels' hulls and led to the spectacular form of self-destruction known as an exit breach. It was the exit growl, the characteristic sound caused by portions of the ship emerging from hyperspace nanoseconds before the rest as the jump field collapsed.
I hate it when I'm right,
Lando said, gesturing with his free hand.
Move it, R2! Now!
The little droid jetted quickly toward the opening, towing the heavily loaded grid behind it. For a moment, Lando thought the frame looked too small for R2 to pass through it. But the droid retracted his treads as far as they would go, turned his body, and cleared the opening by bare centimeters. The equipment grid smoothly passed through behind him.
Wait for me, R2.
3PO called, flailing his arms and legs in midair.
Go ahead.
Lando said to Lobot, passing him the cutting blaster and waving him on.
I'll get 3PO.
Lobot didn't wait to be told twice, swinging himself feet first through the improvised doorway as neatly as a gymnast taking a turn on the parallel bar. Meanwhile, Lando clipped the safety line from the contact suit's belt to the handhold of the frame and launched himself toward the droid, his gloved hand extended to him.
Oh, thank you, Master Lando,
the droid said relievedly as he grabbed hold of Lando's arm. Then 3PO saw Lando's eyes suddenly widen in alarm.
What is it, sir?
Watching from the inner passage, Lobot saw the same thing Lando had seen when he looked past 3PO toward the outer bulkhead. A small opening appearing and quickly irising into an airlock that revealed a stark, starry blackness beyond. Moments later, the external mics on the suits picked up the hiss of outrushing air. Lando did not take the time to answer 3PO's concerned inquiry.
Heads up! Incoming!
He bellowed and swung 3PO by the arms toward the inner doorway. Bracing himself against the frame, Lobot reached through, caught 3PO's right foot, and dragged him into the inner passage. But the rush of air through the inner passage and out through the wound kept building, and it was all Lobot could do to keep himself from being sucked through. Nor was he the only one in trouble. R2's thrusters could not hold against the screaming wind, and he squawked loudly as he was dragged inexorably back down the inner passage toward the opening, clinging determinedly to the equipment grid. Meanwhile, Lando dangled helplessly at the end of his safety line, his feet banging against the edge of the outer airlock as the air grabbed at him on its way into the vacuum beyond. Only 3PO was relatively secure, his metal body braced against one end of the sled frame, blocking part of the opening. but he was waving his arms wildly like a shell-spined mud crawler that had been flipped on its back.
Oh, R2, we're doomed,
He cried.
I never did like space travel. Look where your adventuring has led us.
You have to cut the frame!
Lando was shouting into the comlink.
Cut the frame and it'll pull out. The rest of the hole will close. Do it!
Not with you on that side, Lobot said, climbing across 3PO to where the safety line was attached. There's a take-up crank on that belt line. See if you can pull yourself up that way.
No good!
Said Lando.
Too much load. Just cut the frame, will ya?
Lobot glanced sideways down the corridor to see if he and 3PO were in danger of being knocked through the hole by an out-of-control R2 and his cargo. But to Lobot's relief, he saw that R2 had made his way to the edge of the passage, burned a small hole with his arc welder, and let the hole close around a repair arm. So far, the anchor was holding against the current, which seemed to Lobot to be weakening. Forget it, Lobot directed, reaching down between his braced legs and catching hold of the thin safety line. He began hauling on the line, hand over hand, reeling Lando in like a great white fish. The cyborg's wiry body concealed surprising strength, and soon he had hold of the tow ring on Lando's suit at the back of the neck. Use your thrusters now, full vertical.
Full vertical!
Lando echoed. With one smooth, powerful motion, Lobot pulled Lando up between his widely spaced knees, lying straight back to drag Lando's legs clear and hurl him free down the passage. Quickly sitting back up, Lobot pulled out the cutting blaster and slashed the frame in 2 places. There was a shower of sparks each time, then a puff of D-20 propellant from the broken lines as he kicked out the section between the cuts. It spun free and tumbled out through the airlock on the breeze. The bulkhead groaned under Lobot, and the rest of the frame began to collapse, twisting sideways as it did, until it too was carried away. Seconds later, the hole had closed under them, the pitch of the roaring air rising to a shrill note before it cut off entirely, leaving them in silence.
I guess we only get to use that doorway trick once,
said Lando. The inside of his faceplate was fogged with sweat.
Where'd you learn that?
I learned it wild water rafting on Oko-E, Lobot said. It is the preferred method for getting a raft mate out of the river before the sulfur ice pulls him under. That was my last vacation, he added.
You have unexpected depth, Lobot,
said Lando.
Is everyone all right?
I am certain that several of my circuits are overheated.
3PO pronounced.
With your permission, Master Lando, I would like to perform a self-diagnostic.
Go ahead,
said Lando.
While you're doing that, we'll get R2 free, and then we can start figuring out what to do next.
That should not prove too taxing, said Lobot. The choices appear to be to go that way. He crossed his arms over his chest, pointing a finger in each direction. Or that way.
Shh,
Lando said, craning his head.
Wait, listen.
They listened in silence, with sinking hearts. In the mysterious hollow spaces of the Vagabond, the fading rumble of the entry grinder echoed for a long time.
Blast!
Lando sighed.
She's jumped again.
Something interesting here, said Josala Kren. Craddock Stopa bent forward over the surface scanner. The false color image mapped the undulations of a great glacier as it crawled its way along a widening, steep-sided valley toward a frozen sea. Where? Here, said Josala, pointing out a string of small blue blotches scattered along the northeast edge of the glacier. The side-scanning radar pulled these up. They're sitting anywhere from 11 to 19 meters down in the ice. Rock from the lateral moraine? No, for 2 reasons. First, they're awfully regular in size, oblong, between 1.5 and 2 meters in the long axis. And second, do you know anything about the flow lines in the accumulation zone of a glacier? Not a thing. Something that falls on the surface of a glacier moves down valley with the ice and down into the body of the glacier as more snow falls on top of it, Josala said. The lateral moraine running through that part of the glacier is made up of rock coming off this cliff face. She pointed at a side valley well back along the path of the glacier. So, by the time that rock gets to here, it's 50 meters down. These other objects, they haven't been in the ice as long as that rock underneath them, and they would have had to come onto the ice somewhere in here. Josala traced a circle with her finger over a flat area up valley. That's out in the middle of nothing, said Stopa. Right, she wrinkled her face in thought. It's hard to be sure of the timetables with cataclysmic climatic change, but I'd guess that whatever these are, they've only been in the ice for 50 to 100 years. His eyes widened. Bodies. Burials on the ice. That was my thought. It makes sense. Nomadic groups, or perhaps caves somewhere nearby. Ice caves, possibly. It doesn't matter where they lived, so long as we've found where they died. How deep is the shallowest of those bodies? 11 meters? When Josala nodded, Stopa turned to the pilot. We're going to want our rover. Craddock? I know, but hear me out. We'll wait until the weather's good there, Stopa said, his eyes animated by anticipation. We'll set the rover down right on top of the site. We leave the engine running at idle, so there's no chance for anything to freeze up. We work right out of the gear bay, because all we have to do is take a core. Our equipment ought to be able to handle that. You want to drill a core? Josala said in horror. That'll mangle the remains. Yes, Stopa said. I know it violates the usual protocols, but we weren't sent here to recover bodies. We were sent here to recover biological material. When our reinforcements arrive, they can go down and excavate the other sites. But in the meantime, we'll have something we can analyze and report back on. Josala shook her head. I'd really rather wait for the people who know what they're doing. But we know how to take a core, Stopa said. Kren, a first-year apprentice, knows how to take a core. We'll be out of there in 30 minutes, 20. Josala's reluctance still showed on her face. Craddock drew closer and dropped his voice. The bonus from the NRI would be enough to fund the expedition to Stovox, he said. But if we wait until Panga Rift arrives, we'll have to share the bonus. We might even end up being cut out completely. He waited to see if that would sway her, then added, I give you my word that we'll withdraw at the first sign of any trouble. No, better. I'm making you expedition boss. You say that's it, and that's it. Josala looked up at him with a frown, then passed him to the pilot. What Dr. Stopa said. We're going to want our rover. The archaeologist's little Mark II World rover skimmed across the top of snow-covered Southwest Range and began its descent into the glacier valley. You're on the beam. 850 meters out, said the voice of IX-26's pilot, continuing to talk Stopa and Kren down to their destination. The navigation and sensor arrays of the rover were no match for those of the ferry. Copy, said Stopa, who was at the controls. I'm going from glide to hover mode now. 700, 600, 550. Several small shield doors on the rover's fuselage and delta wings slid open, revealing vector nozzles for the thrust jets. With the rover's nose stall high and the nozzles perpendicular to the wings, the little ship quickly lost its forward velocity and began to settle. Josala was peering out the starboard cockpit view pane, studying the ground below them. The steep inner slope of the Southwest Range wore a smooth blanket of snow, but the surface of the glacier itself was a field of jagged ice blocks, some as large as the rover itself. It looked a lot smoother on the SSR display, Josala said. The rover can cope with a 40-degree terrain tilt. We'll be all right. It's going to be like drilling through rock. But ice won't wear the bits like rock does, said Stopa. We'll get through. 220, the pilot was saying into Stopa's headset. Ease her ahead to port. Copy, Stopa said. Kren, we have to at least give it a try. Just then, a cloud of swirling white particles billowed up around the rover from below, closing in around the cockpit view panes and cutting visibility nearly to zero. It's outdone, Blast, Stopa said quickly. He raised the control handle and the rover climbed nimbly out of the cloud, which immediately began to dissipate beneath them. Not a problem. 150. You can't land us in a whiteout, said Josala. If you set us down on the edge of one of those ice boulders, we'll flip over before the strut levelers can do anything. 95. I'll just hover at 10 meters, until the thrusters blow the site clear of loose material, Stopa said confidently. If I can't get definition on the undercarriage hollow, I won't try to land, all right? All right, Josala said with a sigh. 60, the pilot said. Ease off or you're going to overrun the site. Stopa tapped the air brakes lightly and pulled back on the control handle slightly. As the rover settled toward the glacier, it was once again engulfed in a billow of jet-driven snow. But before long, the swirling cloud began to thin and the horizon returned. 25. Josala peered forward. I can't judge distances without a referent. That big slab of ice, he patted her arm. It's bigger and farther away than you think. 10, 8, 5, easy. Take me to plus 16. I want to put the rover's tail right down on top of it. It's under you now. Plus 6, plus 9, plus 14. Stopa pushed the control handle sharply down, and the rover dropped hard and shook from the impact. Nose tilted down and sliding sideways. It came to a stop with another small jolt, then slowly came to level. There, he said, switching quickly among the undercarriage scanners and studying the display. Those closest to the thrusters were frozen over with steam ice, but the forward and aft scanners were clear. The front landing strut seemed to be wedged in a small crevasse, though no damage was evident. Aft, the body of the rover was sitting comfortably above the ice. It wasn't half bad, he said with a grin, setting the systems to standby. Let's just get it done, Josala said crossly. One behind the other, they made their way through the crawl space over the orbital engine compartment to the crowded gear bay. There they helped each other into their improvised snow gear. The Ferret's sole emergency spacesuit for her, a standard digger's isolation suit for him, augmented by the Ferret pilot's spacesuit glove liners. Neither of them was prepared for the blinding dazzle of the glacier when the gear bay doors swung open. The sky was clear, and the blue-white sun lit the landscape with cold crystal fire as hard to look at as the sun itself. Josala's viewplate adjusted for it, but Stopa had to avert his eyes and squint to keep from being overwhelmed. Spectacular, Stopa exulted. Sightsee when we're finished, Josala chided. Everything took longer than it should have. The core drill base didn't want to latch in the working position, giving Josala reason to worry about whether the bay doors would seal properly when it was time to leave. The gloves made them both clumsy and turned the routine assembly of the first sections of the coring tube into a test. Josala's sounding for the body beneath them was marred by crazy echoes. The drill's gimbal mount froze up until the drill was turned on, complicating the alignment on Josala's sounding. But at last the coring bit chewed its way into the surface of the glacier and headed down into its depths. 7 sections, Stopa shouted over the rumble of the drill. At this angle we'll need 7 sections. Josala waved her hand in acknowledgement and turned away to pull the next section from the rack. It danced under her touch, and she drew her hand back. She pressed her gauntlet against the wall of the bay and felt it shivering. It was then that she realized that what she had thought was her own body shivering was the deck of the rover vibrating under her feet. The drill was roaring now, as though its bearing rings had disintegrated, its lubricants turned to grit. "Turn it off!" she cried, pulling her way along to where Stopa was leaning out the back of the bay, looking down at the core drive and measuring the drill's progress. "Turn it off!" He looked up at her dumbly, and she reached behind him for the controls. The core cylinder spun to a stop, but neither the vibration nor the noise ceased. Just the opposite, in fact. The rumble was growing louder, and the shaking growing worse. With a desperate fear already in their eyes, they looked out from the gear bay at the mountain ridge behind them, the ridge they had flown over just minutes before. The ridge that had been like cotton bathed in sunlight. The middle of the ridge was now hidden behind an onrushing wall of snow and ice, spreading and climbing the sky as it hurtled closer. There was no chance to escape into that sky. The avalanche was on them before they could even quite remember the word. It tumbled the rover before it like a toy, packing its every crevice with snow, engulfing the ship in the furious turbulence of the icy maelstrom. When the flow finally slowed and ceased, its leading edge reaching nearly halfway across the valley, there were 2 more bodies buried on the ice for Penga Rift to recover.
The first thing we need is a way to find this spot again. And this passage is notably lacking in landmarks,
said Lando. Using the cutting blaster, he sliced a small triangle off one corner of the equipment grid.
Where was our doorway? Here?
Lower, said Lobot. There.
I'm glad you're sure,
said Lando.
I'm all turned around.
He cut a slit in the bulkhead, inserted one edge of the triangle, and held it there until the bulkhead closed around it. Then he placed one palm flat against the bulkhead and tried to tug the metal grid out of the wall.
That should do it.
Lobot drifted up with a short length of cord in one hand. We might want more than one marker before we're done, he said, looping the cord through one of the diamond-shaped openings and tying the ends together with an overhand knot. 1 knot equals the first marker. We'll put 2 knots on the next one.
Okay,
said Lando, turning away from the wall.
There's one thing I overlooked when we took inventory. I burned about 60% of my thruster propellant trying to get up here.
I have 91% remaining, said Lobot. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to share my supply with you.
You might end up sharing it by carrying me around on your back,
Lando said.
3PO, how are you doing for thrust mass?
R2 burbled, and 3PO offered the translation.
R2 says that his propellant supply is adequate, but he would like to be informed when any of us locates a power coupling.
With any luck, it'll be right next to an oxygen valve,
Lando said grimly.
All right, we are in a survival situation. This ship has now jumped twice, and we have to assume that it lost any pursuit that was mounted with that second jump. That means our first priority is to locate and disable the hyperdrive and stop this ship.
But Master Lando, if we disable the hyperdrive, we would be stranded.
3PO protested.
We don't know how long. The Vagabond stays in hyperspace. Weeks, months, years. The galaxy is 120,000 light-years across. I like our chances better stranded.
Master Lando, would it not be more prudent to find the masters of this vessel and petition them to take us back to Coruscant?
3PO, I think we are the masters of this vessel now,
Lando said.
We must be if we're going to survive.
He ticked off the priorities on his fingers.
First, we find some way to stop this ship. Second, we find out where that leaves us. Third, we find out who our nearest friend is. Fourth, we find some way to signal them. If we get that all done before Lobot and I run out of air and the droids run out of power, then we can worry about who built the Vagabond and why.
We may need to engage those questions in order to achieve those objectives, said Lobot.
Maybe,
said Lando.
but in my experience, you really don't need to know much about a precision machine in order to smash it.
He pointed a finger to the left, then to the right.
What's your best guess? Hyperdrive aft or forward?
Center of mass is the most efficient placement, Lobot said. Forward. Lando nodded.
Then let's get going.
Colonel Pakpakat hovered near the communications station as the cruiser Glorious dropped out of hyperspace. The chase armada was strung out along 40 light-years, and Glorious was the second bead on the string.
Give them to me as fast as they come,
He said to the tech at the station. Yes, sir. I'm seeing 6 dispatches. An emergency action directive from the fleet office, copied to Captain Garch. A blue letter from the NRI, copied to Captain Hamax. A dispatch marked urgent from the Obroan Institute. Reports from Lightning, Prawn, and Nagua,
the 3 ships behind us.
said Pakpakat.
Very well. Make dispatches available at my station.
Crossing the bridge with long, light-footed strides, Pakpakat eased himself into his flat couch and brought up the secure display. Neither his face nor his carriage betrayed any emotion as he read through the dispatches one after another. When he was finished, he tipped the screen away and let out a long hiss.
Major Lego Baru.
Isidro Legorbaru, the Mahili intelligence officer who was serving as Pakpakat's tactical aide, hurried to his station in response to the summons. Colonel,
We have just received the fleet-wide Level 1 alert.
Pakpakat said, tipping his display upward so that the Major could read the emergency action directive.
My request for additional ships for the search has been denied.
I am under orders to release Marauder, Prawn, and Nagua from their duties here, so that they may return to their respective commands at best possible speed.
That's nearly half our remaining strength, sir, Legorbaru said, shaking his head. What do they expect us to do?
Fail, apparently.
Pakpakat said curtly.
I have also been placed on notice that Glorious may be recalled as well. We are to remain on 1-hour alert status, which means no jumps greater than 1/2 light year.
At least that allows us to proceed with the search, said Legorbaru. But we should call Ketamore forward to fill the gap in the line when Marauder pulls out. She should be finished with recovery work by now anyway.
Ketamore has already jumped to Nichin with the dead and injured from the cavalry,
said Pakpakat.
We will not have her back for another day at least, if they allow her to rejoin us at all.
Legorbaru peered intently at the display. I don't get it, Colonel. Why the sudden change of priorities? What's happening back there? It must be something big if they can't spare a 30-year-old gunship and a couple of interdiction pickets,
That information was not made available to me,
said Pakpakat, his mouth curled in an unhappy threat snarl. Maybe I can get something out of Channel, said Legorbaru. Would you like me to try? Pakpakat nodded.
Be still.
He said.
I would like to have a better idea of just who I must wrestle to keep this mission alive.